Hi, I'm Chris. I am the tech writer at Chronosphere, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of context to the video you're about to see. Chronosphere is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that relies on having inclusive language. This includes in our documentation, in our website copy, in our marketing copy, and in job postings. And in this video, I explain some of the ways that I ensure that in the product documentation. I hope that makes things clearer, and enjoy. Hi, I'm Christian Chiller. Welcome to this video, which is a recorded version of a presentation I did at All Things Open back in 2021. The subject is reducing negative and biased language and other problematic language in documentation or in text generally. Firstly, a disclaimer, and there's going to be a content warning in order to demonstrate how to identify and remove this sort of language. I need to show examples of it. So it is purely for illustrative purposes. Let's clarify what I mean when I mention biased, negative, problematic language. There's a few categories, potential categories. It could be language that is patronizing. That is language that is demeaning, makes the reader feel stupid, or like they don't know what they're doing, or they're an idiot, or yes, I think we have read this kind of thing quite a lot actually. A language that when you read it, you think, well, I thought I knew what I was doing, and now this makes this seem very easy, so I obviously don't, or yes, etc. Rude language. This is probably less so and less common, but where the writer is intentionally or unintentionally just plain rude to the reader. This could be rude language, just a rude way of writing, etc., etc. Overly negative. This is probably the vaguest one, but there are certain phrases and words and turns of phrase that just come across as overly negative and can put a reader off and make them feel kind of uncomfortable. Biased. Here we are talking about unnecessary usage of gender, race, etc., etc. There are, of course, times when it is necessary, but quite often it is not. Outdated language. Language that we have generally as a community or a society or as a country or as a language group have decided it's just not what we use anymore. It's old-fashioned, it's outdated, there are better terms. Unhelpful language. Language that adds nothing, or worst, language that can actually make reading and understanding the text harder, worse, and more difficult for a reader, and again, kind of make them feel patronized, and etc., etc. And of course, these are just some examples, and there's plenty more, but this is enough for the purposes of this video anyway. So let's talk about linting. What is linting? Well, according to Wikipedia, linting is a static code analysis tool used to flag programming errors, bugs, stylistic errors, and suspicious constructs. Well, this sounds a little bit like kind of what we are trying to identify, doesn't it? So can we use linting for language, for human language? Well, yes, we can. And it's not necessarily a new concept, but it's not always called linting. Here's an example of some of the kind of tools you might have come across in this kind of ecosystem. Something like Grammarly, for example. This is commercial, proprietary, closed source. It has to share your data to a central location, which has caused issue for some people, but does mean they can do analysis on the text and get a context of what you're writing about, so offer all sorts of kind of more nuanced suggestions. It's not particularly customizable, but it's easy to use and relatively affordable. Commercial inbuilt tools. For example, you might have seen this increasingly so in Google Docs, but also in other tools. And these kind of straddle between spelling, grammar, and then stylistic and other suggestions. Something like Acrolinks, this is definitely aimed at enterprise and big users. It's expensive, but very customizable, quite comprehensive, and easy to share amongst the team and workflows and things like that. On the open source side, we have TextLint. This is a series of NPM packages that you can assemble together to accomplish certain use cases, certain things you're trying to check for. Then there's what I will call one-use tools. These are things like Alex, WriteGood, JobLint, etc. These all look for one particular kind of aspect of language. Language tool, which is a general purpose tool that's been around for a little while, and actually some other tools use it under the hood. It has a lot of rules, it's quite customizable. It's not always been exceptionally good at working with technical copy because it doesn't always recognize code, but it's certainly a very powerful option. And then finally, Vale, which is my option or my choice, and I will dig into now why that is the case. So why do I like Vale? Well, firstly, it's open source. Secondly, it's self-hosted. You run it yourself, or the processing of the language happens on your machine or on a machine you control. It's free. There is still the commercial Vale server, which lets you check in some other context, which I will come to later, but that is also now being open sourced and is mostly free as well. It wraps well around other tools. It actually can use Language Tool as well for additional power. It also replicates features of JobLint, Alex, WriteGood, and some other options. It's highly configurable, and we'll come to that later. It's very lightweight. It's a Go binary. It doesn't take up many resources when you run it. Fantastic. What are the install options? Well, as something that's open source with quite a large ecosystem, there are quite a few. Homebrew, Chocolatey, Linux package managers, Docker, GitHub Actions if you want to run them on CI builds, and also plugins for editors. Lots and lots of common editors. And of course, there's also a binary you can just download and install as well. And browser and Google Docs if you use Vale Server, which, as I previously mentioned, was commercial up until quite recently. All right, enough of that. How about an install and setup demo? So here you can see I use Homebrew, the popular macOS and now Linux package manager, to install Vale and thus keep it up to date with new releases. And over on the right hand side you can see a typical setup for a local Vale project. I have a Vale configuration file and then a folder of styles with the individual collections of style rules. And here you can see how you run Vale from the command line, just the command and then the file you want to check. And in this example is a list of lots and lots of warnings, errors, and information on the line and character of the text, the message about what the error might be, the rule that was triggered, etc., etc. Here you can see the Vale extension for Visual Studio Code, along with its README and configuration options. I have it installed already. And if I take that same text file from earlier with Vale running over it, you can see the different rules triggered and the similar sort of text that you saw on the command line. And there is the other way you can see it in the problems output in Visual Studio Code, showing again the same errors in a different way. And back to some slides. The power of Vale comes from its pre-built styles and the styles you can create as well, which are a series of YAML files that represent rules. Let's have a quick look first at some of the pre-built ones. These come in various guises, created by the maintainers, created by the community, and created by the people who actually create these style guides in the first place. Things like the Microsoft, Google, IBM style guide. And then, as I mentioned earlier, also things like WriteGood, Alex, JobLint. These have all been replicated as Vale pre-built styles. And then kind of in-house style guides, sometimes created by the teams that use them, sometimes created by others. Cockroach, Homebrew, GCC, many others. What does a style comprise of? Well, it's basically a series of YAML files that are kind of user-friendly regex, shall we say. Regex is powerful, but quite complex to understand, and I still barely understand it myself. But here is some ways that Vale tries to make this a little more understandable in this context. So, for example, one type of rule could be in existence, checking for a certain token, a certain word, etc., etc. Extending that, substitution, looking for that token and suggesting an alternative to that token. Occurrence, a number of occurrences of a token. For example, Oxford comma, things like that. Repetition, looking for repeated tokens, repeated words, other contexts, other uses as well. Consistency, so consistency of two related tokens. For example, English versus American spelling, smart quotes versus straight quotes, these kinds of things. Conditional, a token based on the existence of another token. Capitalization, the capitalization of text, predominantly headings, things like title case, uppercase, etc., etc. Readability scores, not really looking for particular tokens, but using quite common algorithms to give your text a readability score. Spelling, there is a spell checker that you can use and add a custom list of words to. It wraps around the operating system level dictionary, A-spell, Hunspell, things like that. And then finally, this is one of the newer extension points and rules that I haven't had a tremendous amount of time to look into yet, but this is a sequence. This gets Vale a little bit more into the natural language processing world, a grammar-based rule instead of just patterns. Okay, enough theory. Let's have a look at a demonstration of some rules and what sorts of things they might pick up. Let's have a look at the configuration behind getting text like this, highlighted like this, and flagged for problems. We start with a configuration file, a .vale.ini file. This has a styles path, a path where it can find all the styles to use. In this case, it's in the .github folder because I also have this running as a GitHub action, and that's the structure it needs. Then we have minimum alert level. This is basically the minimum alert level to show. If we made this higher, then not everything would be visible, etc., etc. This is a line to say what to check. In this case, we're saying check everything, but we could actually add this to only checking Markdown files, only checking HTML files, or more interestingly, we can actually have multiple of these sections to have different rules based on the file extension. And here in this case, I'm now just saying base everything on all the rules in all of these folders. But I could also individually override some of these down here using the format of the style and then the rule and then an override. This could be changing the default level, or it could also be disabling and enabling certain rules as well. Okay, let's have a look at some actual examples of styles and rules. So here's one. This is saying using everyone knows may come across as condescending. This is the Alex. This comes from the Vale interpretation of the Alex linter, condescending. So this matches to the Alex folder and in the condescending.yaml file. And here we can see this is an existence rule, extends existence. This is the message we see using a variable here. A link to more information, which isn't really rendered anywhere in this particular example, the level, error, ignore the case or not, and then the tokens to check for. And this is just, well, we could change this and add all sorts of other options to it. Let's have a look for another one. It's not quite relevant to our use case, but we'll have a look here. That's also, here's one. So master and slave node setup. So we've actually got a couple of different rules getting triggered here. We'll go for the Alex one again. So alex.race, so that's down here. And here again, we can now see it's a substitution rule. Consider using this instead of this. Ignore case, yes, level warning. We might want to suggest that. This, if we were using Vale server, would actually let us replace it in line, and then the ones to look for. So we can see a lot of kind of common problematic phrases that we'd like to replace with different things. This is similar down here with some of these gendered jobs as well. So this is the demo style gender bias. Let's have a look. So similar again, substitution. Consider using this instead of this, ignore case, level error, and we have, and this is the regex here, looking for particular terms and offering suggestions instead. So you can start to see that with those substitution and existence rules, you can actually undertake a lot of what we looked at here. And some of the other extension points are useful for other things, but possibly less useful in this particular context. And to just show how this could work as a GitHub action, here is an example that I showed in the presentation. So here is a pull request with a change, and you can see the same sorts of errors but highlighted in a different way. And of course, with the action, we can also define whether we want to check everything or only the things that changed, etc., etc. But you start to see the point here and how the same messages get displayed in different ways depending on the tool you're using.